back. Still have my first page up, but we're going to flip it. Okay, so now that, oops, I'm doing this all backwards. Now that we've actually talked about what like those values mean in our sine and cosine functions, let's go through and talk about what each of the functions looks like on a graph. So for a sine function, it's going to have a maximum value of 1 and a minimum value of -1. Its range goes from -1 to 1, and it oscillates between those two numbers, okay? The period for sine x is 2 pi, so it completes one full cycle every time within 2 pi units on the x-axis. And I like to mark my x-axis by cutting it in half so that I make 4 different sections. So this section is pi because half of 2 pi is just pi. Then we cut it in half again. Half of pi is pi over 2. And then halfway between pi and 2 pi is going to be 3 pi over 2. Okay, so sine of x always starts at the midline. Okay, and it goes to a max right after that. So it's going to start at our midline, and then at the next point, it goes to a max, goes back down to our midline again, hits our min, and then ends back at our midline. So it's going to pass through like this. Okay. Now, negative sine is basically going to do the same thing. It's going to start at the midline. Okay. And it's going to have the same range. It's going to go from -1 to 1. It's same period, 2 pi. Pi, 3 pi over 2, and pi over 2. The only difference with negative sine is the next thing it's going to do is go to a min. Okay, so it's going to start at the midline, and instead of hopping up like it did before, it's going to come back down to a minimum, then go back to our midline, then hit our maximum, then go back down to our midline again. Okay, so like this. All right, so that's our negative sine function. Now we have cosine. Cosine starts at a max and then goes to the midline. Okay, it has the same range. Sine and cosine both have the same range and the same period. Okay, and then let's see. So it starts at a max. So it's going to start up here at 1, go back down to our midline, get all the way back down to our minimum, go back up to our midline, and then end at our maximum. So it's going to do something like this. All right. And then negative cosine is the same thing, but it's going to start at the minimum. Okay. So same range, same period, same tick marks. Okay. But this time we're starting at a minimum, going to the midline, getting up to our maximum, going back down to our midline, and then all the way back down to our minimum again. Okay. So that's it for sine, negative sine, cosine, and negative cosine. So now our last page is going to be just a few example questions where we have a function written out and it asks you what each of those parameters are: the midline, the amplitude, the period. It asks us which is the correct type of graph and what is the equation of the graph. So all together. So let's go through this together. So midline, remember, this is probably the easiest one to figure out. Midline is halfway between our min and max. So my min is at -4 and my max is at 6. If you absolutely cannot figure out how to like calculate halfway in between, just say, okay, I'm going to start up here, go 1 unit down, start up here, down here, go 1 unit up, and then go until you meet in the middle. But between 6 and -4, there are 10 total units. So that means halfway between would be 5 units from either the top or the bottom. 5 units from the top happens to be at 1. And so I'm going to go ahead and highlight this. Our midline is going to be right there. And we can see that if I folded this up, the sine, or I don't know if it's sine or cosine. Yeah, we haven't talked about that. If we folded this trig curve together, we would have folded it in half. So remember, our midline is written as y equals something. This one is going to be y equals 1 because 1 was at where our midline was at. Okay. Now remember that our amplitude is the distance either between the maximum and the midline or the minimum and the midline. You can see that our amplitude can be calculated in multiple places here, but all of these have the same vertical distance between the max or min and midline, okay? I guess I'll go ahead and color all of them in. Okay, so you can use any one of these. It doesn't matter. They're going to give you the same answer. So if we count up, we know that this is 5 units long. To go from 1 to 6 should give us 5 units. So our amplitude is 5. Okay, now next is our period. How long does it take to complete one full cycle? So let's see where we can start. So at 0, we start down here at a minimum. So that means we would have to end on a minimum again. Okay, so I'm going to go all the way through this. Look, I hit a midline, I hit a max, midline again, and then I got all the way back down to a minimum. Okay, so we started and ended in the same place, both are at a minimum. Oops. Okay, and we hit everything we needed to. Okay, we hit all the pieces of the graph. Right, so my period here, it took us pi units to get there. Now remember that when we actually put this in the equation, we need the b value. So remember that our period is equal to 2 pi over b. So we need to solve for that b. So pi is equal to 2 pi over b. We can solve for b by multiplying both sides by b to get it out of the denominator. So then we get pi b equals 2 pi. And now we have a pi on each side, so we can just cancel those guys out. So we know that b is equal to 2, okay? And that is going to be, so here's our period. That's what's going to go inside the equation. Our amplitude, amplitude is yellow. It's right here, okay? And now it asks us to circle the correct type of graph. So we want to look, technically all of these sine and cosine are just shifts of each other. So you could talk, but we're not talking about any horizontal shifts here. So we just want to look at what starts off. So we start at a minimum. If I go back to, I don't remember where I put it. This original, here, the last sheet of notes. The only place where we start at a minimum is negative cosine. So negative cosine must be my correct formula. And now if I go back and I look and I fill in my yellow, green, and pink parts, I know that I should have y equals negative, because I had negative cosine. 5 is going to be my yellow piece. And then my b was 2. And then my d, my pink value, was 1. Okay, so that should be my equation for that problem. And again, the 1 comes from the midline. The 5 comes from the amplitude. And the 2 is a proportion of our period, which was pi. We calculated b by using the formula that we have on the front. Okay, so now we have another problem. So again, I'm going to do the same sort of thing. I'm going to start with the midline. Okay, so I'm going to find my midline. So I have my max here at 7, my min down here at -1. -1 combined, so 1 unit down and 7 units up should give us 8 total units. So halfway between that is 4. So if I go 4 down, 1, 2, 3, 4 from my 7, I see that my midline should be right here at 3. Okay, so my midline is going to be at y equals 3. My amplitude, remember, is going to be from the max to the midline or from the min to the midline. So there are 3 places on this graph where we can solve for our amplitude. okay? Our amplitude happens to be 4 units because it took 4 units to get from either the max to the midline or the min to midline. The next thing is my period. So my period is how long it takes to complete one full cycle. So I want to start at my midline because that's where it intersects the x equals 0. So if I start at my midline, I'm going to hit my max, get back down to a midline, and technically that's where I started, but I haven't hit a min yet, so I have to keep going. So I keep going down, I hit my min, and then I end on my midline right here, okay? So my period went through this whole piece of the function, and it took 2 pi units to do that, okay? Remember that we do need to solve, this was my period, we do need to solve for the actual b value that's going to go in the function because it's not going to be 2 pi. So I'm going to take my period, which was 2 pi, and I'm going to set it equal to 2 pi over b. I'm going to do the same thing I did last time, multiply by b on both sides just to get it in the numerator. And then I have 2 pi b equals 2 pi. Now I can divide by 2 pi on both sides to isolate my b, and I get that b is just 1, okay? So my coefficient of the x there is just going to be 1 unit, okay? So now I need to look at my equations. So if I look back at the sheet that we used before, this starts and ends at a midline, so we can just eliminate our cosine functions real quick. And so now we look at our sine functions. We have one that starts at a midline and goes to a max, and one that starts at a midline and then goes to a min. The correct one should be the one that goes to a max, so we want positive sine. So I'm going to circle that one right here. And so now I want to fill in my equation. So my equation should be y equals, I have a positive sine, so I want my amplitude number to come in front of that. Then my x had a b value of 1 in front of it, okay? You don't technically have to write that though. And then I want to add on my 3, which was my midline, okay? So I have my amplitude, my midline, and then my b value, which came from my period, okay? Okay, so that hopefully will get you through the homework for today. Post your questions on the discussion board and I'll answer them before next class. I hope today was helpful and I will see you guys later.